This is the last image of Molly, captured about 13 minutes before she went missing.
Molly said, "Goodbye, I love you," and ran off. It was her 8th day on her new job as a lifeguard. That was the last time I saw or heard from my Molly.
In addition to this composite sketch of the man in the white car, other persons of interest have been reported.
It's been a collective trauma for all of us, and it's time for us to come to a place where we can have some resolution.
The case remains unsolved.
On June 27th of the year 2000, 16-year-old Molly Bish was dropped off by her mother Maggie at the parking lot of Commons Pond in Warren, Massachusetts. It was 10 a.m. and her shift as a lifeguard was about to start. At 10:20, the first families arrived at the pond, only to find Molly's things, including her flip-flops, neatly set around her chair, but no sign of the lifeguard. Despite the extensive search, the largest one Massachusetts has ever undertaken, and the hours of work, nothing came up. Molly had simply vanished. 3 years later, a hunter would find a blue swimsuit in the woods nearby, and not far from it, the skeletal remains of the missing teen were recovered. A 20-year investigation would lead only to dead ends and only persons of interest. Meanwhile, the Bish family asked themselves the same question over and over again. Who ended Molly's life, and will this case ever be solved? Molly Ann Bish was born August 2nd of 1983. She was the youngest of Maggie and John Sr.'s 3 children. The Bish family was originally from Detroit. However, an incident in their old neighborhood pushed them to move. A woman was attacked walking back home from work and was later found murdered. This scared Maggie and John, who decided to relocate and find a safer place to raise their children. And just like that, the Bish family moved to Warren, Massachusetts. Life in Warren is quiet. It's a small town surrounded by nature, but a peaceful environment to raise children in, which is exactly what Maggie and John were looking for. John Jr., Heather, and Molly grew up to be very happy there, especially Molly. Since she was a child, Molly stood out from the crowd. She was kind and outgoing, and wasn't afraid to bring out her goofy and fun side. At school she proved to be a great student. She had no trouble getting good grades, and was heading to a bright future. But if there was something she especially loved, it was sports. Molly was very athletic and played both soccer and basketball in high school, and as someone who loved the outdoors, she would seek every opportunity she had to spend time among nature. That's probably why, in the summer of 2000, she inherited her brother's lifeguard job at the pond. For the past 3 years, John had been the lifeguard, so it was her brother who trained her and prepared her to take over. Molly was excited for this job. Not only would she get to spend time outside, but there were also activities for children planned in the pond where she'd be working. Molly had a passion for children. Her sister Heather had a baby at the time, and Molly loved her. Working with children was her dream, and after high school, she wanted to go to college and work in the field of education. So after learning from her brother and working hard to earn her certification, Molly started her job on June 19th of 2000, where she was going to spend the whole summer as a lifeguard at Commons Pond. Commons Pond is a small recreational area located in a central and residential part of Warren. During the summer, they offer swimming lessons for children, and it was a popular place for families to cool off from the heat. The pond is surrounded by an artificial beach, and that's where Molly's lifeguard post was located. Every morning, Maggie Bish would drive Molly to the pond. However, on June 27th, it would be the last day she would get to do that. On June 27th, swimming lessons were due to begin at Commons Pond, and Molly was running late. Her mother drove her to work just in time, and she arrived at the parking lot at exactly 10 a.m. Mother and daughter said their goodbyes, and Molly hurried down to the beach to set up for the day. However, at 10:20, only 20 minutes after Molly had arrived, the first family got to the beach, only to find nobody was there. A mother saw the lifeguard post was set up. There was a towel, flip-flops, and even a backpack around the chair and bench. However, the teenage lifeguard was nowhere to be found. As the minutes went by and more parents arrived, the absence of a lifeguard became strange, especially since all her things were left at the post. So one of the parents eventually called the parks commissioner and reported their concerns. The parks commissioner quickly went to the beach and saw for himself that Molly wasn't there, and after a quick search of the surroundings, he called the police. At around 1 p.m., 3 hours after dropping her daughter off, Maggie got a call. It was the police, and they were saying that Molly was not at the pond and she hadn't been all morning, although her things were still there. Maggie was shocked. She had dropped Molly off herself that morning. What did they mean she was gone? The family quickly went to the pond to try and figure out what was happening, but when they arrived, they found that the police weren't as anxious as them about Molly being gone. The initial thought was that Molly had left her job voluntarily and was maybe just hanging out with her friends. They also suggested that she had perhaps run away from home, a popular assumption when teenagers go missing, which only frustrates the parents who can sense when something doesn't add up, and in this case, none of these initial theories made sense. The family knew this wasn't a runaway. Not only were her shoes still there, along with all of her belongings, but Molly was responsible and hardworking. She wouldn't just take off and disappear, especially not without her shoes. Immediately they knew something had happened to her. So police took to another theory, that she had drowned. Her brother John, who had trained her to take over his job as a lifeguard, thought this was very unlikely. His sister knew about safety, she was an excellent swimmer, and no witnesses had seen her drown. Although this happened around 10 a.m., the pond was soon filled with people, so someone would have seen or heard something. Regardless, the pond was searched for signs of Molly and a possible incident which could result in her drowning, but after a whole day of searching, no trace of Molly was found. It wasn't until the next day when police started treating this as a missing children's case, and the investigation took the course it should have had from the start. Molly hadn't drowned. She had disappeared. On June 28th, at 6 a.m., one of the largest search operations ever conducted in Massachusetts began in hopes to find Molly. There were helicopters using infrared cameras, mounted units, search dogs, and volunteers. Hundreds of people from the local and state police, as well as neighbors, looked for Molly tirelessly. However, she was nowhere to be found. Nothing at the scene suggested there had been any kind of foul play. Her towel was sitting on the back of her chair, her flip-flops were right in front of it, her water bottle was sitting beside her post, her backpack, containing 2 whistles, a first aid kit, and a 2-way police radio, was undisturbed on the nearby bench she always left it on. Back in 2000, when the use of cell phones was still limited, Molly's contact with emergencies in case there was one at the pond was using a 2-way radio she collected every morning on her way to work, and once she arrived and set up at the pond, she would report to the police at the start of her shift. Investigators retraced her steps leading up to the moment of her disappearance, but nothing stood out of the ordinary in her routine. That morning, on June 27th, Maggie had driven Molly to work like she always did. They were running a little tight on time, since Molly was usually at the pond a little before 10 o'clock to set up. At 9:50 they stopped at a convenience store to buy water. At 9:56 she collected her radio from the station, and at 9:58 they pulled into the pond's parking lot. Maggie saw the lot was empty. Only a truck delivering sand for the pond's beach was there. Mother and daughter said their goodbyes, and Molly rushed to the beach to set up for the first day of swimming lessons. However, that morning, Molly never reported the start of her shift to the police, and 20 minutes later, parents began to arrive and eventually called the parks commissioner to report that the lifeguard was nowhere to be found. However, dismissing the theories of Molly running away or drowning, Molly Bish told the police something that changed the course of the investigation. The day before Molly disappeared, June 26th, Maggie had driven her daughter like she always did. When they pulled into the parking lot that morning, there was a man with a mustache smoking outside a white sedan. As soon as she saw him, Maggie was uncomfortable. He was watching Molly closely, in a way that made her nervous to leave her daughter there. Regardless, Molly had to work, so Maggie helped her set up her post at the beach. When she walked back to her car, leaving Molly behind, she saw the man was still there, sitting inside his car. She mentioned how she locked eyes with him, and he just stared back at her. Just to be safe, Maggie had waited until he'd pulled out of the parking lot before leaving herself. This incident from the day before the 16-year-old went missing seemed relevant, so police made a sketch of the man, which was the only clue that could potentially shine a light on what happened to Molly. Although Maggie hadn't seen the stranger on the day Molly vanished, the sketch proved to be somewhat helpful at the beginning. Another witness said he saw someone with a similar description at the pond's parking lot a few minutes before Molly arrived. A second witness also came forward with information about a white sedan with a similar description to the one Maggie gave, parked at a nearby cemetery. This cemetery is connected to the pond by a path, so it's very likely that if someone had taken Molly, they had access through this path so as not to be seen in the parking lot. Considering only 20 minutes went by from when Maggie dropped her off and the first parents arrived at the pond, whatever happened to Molly happened fast. There were no screams or sounds of a fight heard. Molly's things were undisturbed, and no signs of foul play were evident at the scene. This means that if a stranger took her, they would have probably had a gun, another weapon, or some way to keep Molly quiet and get her into their vehicle in a matter of minutes. However, no signs of this man or anyone matching his description were found during the search for Molly. To this day, it's the largest and most expensive search for a missing person ever undertaken in Massachusetts. And the most frustrating one too. Molly was simply gone. In the spring of 2003, a hunter was making his way through the woods in Whiskey Hill, just a few miles away from the pond where Molly vanished from, when he came across what looked like part of a blue women's bathing suit. Molly Bish had been wearing a similar bathing suit the day she disappeared, so the discovery was reported to the police. The bathing suit was immediately sent to the lab for DNA testing, but Molly's parents already knew it was hers. Her mother had bought it for her the summer she disappeared. When DNA confirmed the suit was indeed Molly's, the search began, only this time they knew they were likely to find scattered remains. And they did. A skull, 26 bones, a lock of hair, and a tongue ring, all belonging to Molly, confirmed that the teenager had been killed. Although it was impossible to determine a cause of death with so little left of her, the main theory suggested she was murdered and buried somewhere in the woods. After years, animals had dug most of it out and scattered it around a 500-foot area. The Bish family buried their daughter on what would have been her 20th birthday in August of 2003 in an emotional tribute to her life. But the events of June 27th were still a mystery. What exactly happened to Molly Bish? Over 20 years of investigation haven't been able to answer any questions of what really happened on the morning when Molly vanished. Hundreds of tips have come in over the years, none of which have resulted in substantial leads. The only lead for a suspect investigators had was a decades-old sketch of a man who potentially had something to do with Molly's disappearance, and attempts to identify that man have proven to be challenging. The first strong lead came in 2009, when a Florida man convicted of murdering his girlfriend was investigated as a suspect. Rodney Stanger had lived just a few miles away from Warren for over 20 years, and only a few months after Molly's disappearance, he moved to Florida. Rodney had murdered his girlfriend, Crystal Morrison, who he'd been with for over 2 decades. After seeing what he had been capable of, the victim's sister thought this may not be the first time he'd killed someone, and she alerted the Massachusetts authorities since Rodney had a white sedan at the time of Molly's disappearance. He'd also been fishing at Commons Pond and hunting in the area where Molly's body was found. When compared next to the sketch, police saw a resemblance and decided to investigate further. However, no evidence was found of his involvement, and he was never charged in the case of Molly Bish. Another lead came in 2011, when a man named Gerald Battistoni was named a suspect. A private detective investigating the case had a reason to believe he was involved in Molly's death. Gerald had several charges of rape in the 80s and early 90s, and he'd been seen in the area where Molly's remains were found. He too resembled the sketch of the mysterious man in the white sedan, and when he found he was being named a suspect in the case, as well as another murder case in the area, he attempted to take his own life in prison, but failed to do so. DNA testing was conducted to find out if he was involved in Molly's case, but the results were inconclusive. Gerald Battistoni died in November of 2014, and once again, the trail was cold. But in June of 2021, a new development brought hope to the case and the prospect of finally answering the question of who killed Molly Bish.
Convicted sex offender Frank Sumner was named a suspect in the case last June.
He's a person of interest, a suspect, if you will, in her disappearance and murder.
Sumner had a violent past that included kidnapping and raping a 21-year-old woman.
The county district attorney announced on June 3, 2021, that thanks to the investigation still in process and the tip lines available for the public to come forward, there was a new person of interest in the case, Francis Sumner Sr. Francis was born in 1945, and between 1960 and 2016, he lived in Massachusetts, where he worked at several auto repair shops. The new potential suspect had an extensive criminal record dating back to the 80s. Many of his charges included rape and kidnapping, for which he was sentenced and would have been released in the late 90s. However, questioning the suspect was not possible. Francis Sumner was found dead in his home in 2016 and was never questioned on the disappearance and murder of Molly Bish.
Despite his criminal history, Sumner's DNA was never entered into any criminal databases. Sources tell us investigators hoping to solve Molly's murder are now working with DNA from his son, Frank Sumner Jr.
Investigators are now asking the public to dig into their memories and try to find out more about Francis's habits, his whereabouts at the time, or any other information that could help confirm whether he had any involvement in the murder. The family of Francis Sumner quickly spoke out and demanded the DA provided them with any evidence of his involvement. However, since this is still an ongoing investigation, naming him a person of interest is a part of that investigation, and authorities have deemed it necessary to let the public know who is in their radar in order to bring closure to the family of Molly Bish. As of today, a year later, there have been no new developments, and Francis Sumner's involvement is still just a theory. Molly Bish's family, who've been working endlessly to try and keep this case in the public eye, are anxious to learn what investigators have found and how close they really are to solving this 20-year-old mystery. From the moment their daughter disappeared, Maggie and John Bish felt they had to do something to prevent this tragedy from striking other families. So while they were still looking for their daughter, they set up the Molly Bish Foundation as a way to spread the knowledge and understanding of child and family safety and push laws that will protect minors from faulty police work. When Molly disappeared, authorities' first response was to dismiss it as a runaway. This sacrificed valuable time in searching for Molly. The goal of the foundation is to perfect training in children's missing persons cases and ensure the first response is always effective. Over the years, they've promoted training of first responders, they've established task forces to identify and change laws that may be outdated regarding missing people, and they've aided in legislations for the promotion of familial DNA searches as an extra step when a DNA profile comes back with no hits. This technology would quickly narrow down the search for suspects, especially with the ever-growing DNA databases. If you'd like to know more about the hard work put into the Molly Bish Foundation, the link will be in the description. The Bish family was struck by tragedy, but while they mourn their loss, they've decided to become a voice of change, to protect other children and make sure nobody has to go through what they endured. The case to find out who killed Molly and why is still open. If you have any information that may help in the investigation, please use the contact numbers and links you will find below in the description.